Chapter 7 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Plungers. They have the most select clientele in the city here. Constance Dunlap was sitting in the white, steamy room of Charmant's beauty shop. Her informant, reclining dreamily in a luxurious wicker chair, bathed in the perspiring vapor, had evidently taken a fancy to her. "And no wonder, either, they fix you up so well," she rattled on. Then, confidingly, "Now, last night after the show, a party of us went to supper and a dance, and it was in the wee small hours when we broke up. But Madame here can make you all over again. Floretta," she called to an attendant who had entered, "if Mr. Warrington calls up on the phone, say I'll call him later." "Yes, Miss LaRue." Constance glanced up quickly as Floretta mentioned the name of the popular young actress. Stella LaRue was a pretty girl on whom the wild dissipation of the night life of New York was just beginning to show its effects. The name of Warrington, too, recalled to Constance instantly some gossip she had heard in Wall Street about the disagreement in the board of directors of the new rubber syndicate, and the effort to oust the president whose escapades were something more than mere whispers of scandal. This was the woman in the case. Constance looked at Stella now with added interest as she rose languidly, drew her bathrobe about her superb figure carelessly in such a way as to show it at best advantage. "I've had more or less to do with Wall Street myself," observed Constance. "Oh, have you? Isn't that interesting?" cried Stella. "I hope you're not putting money in rubber?" queried Constance. "On the contrary," rippled Stella, then added, "You're going to stay? Let me tell you something. Have Floretta do your hair. She's the best here. Then come around to see me in the dormitory if I'm here when you are through. Won't you?" Constance promised, and Stella fluttered away like the pretty butterfly that she was, leaving Constance to wonder at the natural gravitation of plungers in the money market toward plungers in the white lights. Charmant's beauty parlor was indeed all its name implied, a temple of the cult of adornment, the last cry in the effort to satisfy what is more than health, wealth, and happiness to some women, the fundamental feminine instinct for beauty. Constance had visited the beauty specialist to have an incipient wrinkle smoothed out. Frankly, it was not vanity, but she had come to realize that her greatest asset was her personal appearance. Once that had a chance to work, her native wit and keen ability would carry her to success. Madame Charmant herself was a tall, dark-skinned, dark-haired, dark-eyed, well-groomed woman who looked as if she had been stamped from a die for a fashion plate, and then the die had been thrown away. All others like her were spurious copies, counterfeits. More than that, she affected the name of Vera, which in itself had the ring of truth. And so Charmant had prevailed on Constance to take a full course in beautification and withhold the wrinkle at the source. "Besides, you know, my dear," she purred, "there's nothing discovered by the greatest minds of the age that we don't apply at once." Constance was not impervious to feminine reason, and here she was. "Has Miss LaRue gone?" she asked when at last she was seated in a comfortable chair, again sipping a little aromatic cup of coffee. "No, she's resting in one of the little dressing rooms." She followed Floretta down the corridor. Each little compartment had its neat, plain, white enameled bed, a dresser, and a chair. Stella smiled as Constance entered. "Yes," she murmured in response to the greeting. "I feel quite myself now." "Mr. Warrington on the wire," announced Floretta a moment later, coming down the corridor again with a telephone on a long, unwinding wire. "Hello, Alfred. Oh, rocky this morning," Constance overheard. "I said to myself, never again, until the next time. Vera? Oh, she was as fresh as a lark. Can I lunch with you downtown?" "Of course." Then, as she hung up the receiver, she called, "Floretta, get me a taxi." "Yes, Miss LaRue." "I always have a feeling here," whispered Stella, "that I am being listened to. I mean to speak to Vera about it sometime. By the way, wouldn't you like to join us tonight? Vera will be along, and Mr. Warrington, and perhaps Diamond Jack Braden. You know him?" Constance confessed frankly that she did not have the pleasure of the acquaintance of the well-known turfman and first-nighter. She hesitated. Perhaps it was that Stella liked. Almost anyone else would have been overeager to accept. But to Constance, sure of herself now, nothing of the sort was worth scrambling for. Besides, She was wondering how a man with the fight of his life on his hands could find time to lunch downtown, even with Stella. "I've taken quite a fancy to you," pressed Stella. "Thank you. It's very kind of you," Constance answered. "I shall try very hard to be there. I'll leave a box for you at the office. Come around after the performance to my dressing room." "Miss Larue, your taxi's waiting," announced Floretta. "Thanks. Are you going now, Mrs. Dunlap? Yes? Then ride down in the elevator with me." They parted at the foot of the elevator, and Constance walked through the arcade of the office building in which the beauty parlor occupied the top floor. She stopped at a florist's stand to admire the flowers, but more for an excuse to look back at Stella. As Stella stepped into a taxicab, showing a generous wealth of silken hosiery beneath the tango gown, Constance was aware that the driver of another cab across the street was also interested. She noticed that he turned and spoke to his fare through the open window. The cab swung around to follow the other, and Constance caught a fleeting glimpse of a familiar face. "Drummond!" she exclaimed, almost aloud. What did it mean? Why had the detective been employed to follow Stella? Instinctively, she concluded that he must be engaged by Mrs. Warrington. "I must accept Stella's invitation," she said to herself excitedly. At least she should be put on her guard. That evening, as she was looking over the newspapers, her eye caught the item in the Wall Street edition. Rubber Syndicate Dissension. Break in stock follows effort of strong minority to oust Warrington from presidency. Then followed a brief account of the struggle of a powerful group of directors to force Warrington, Braden, and the rest out, with a hint at the scandal of which everyone now was talking. "I never yet knew a man who went in for that sort of thing that lasted long in business," she observed. "This is my chance, a crowd riding for a fall." Constance chose a modest orchestra seat in preference to the place in a box which Stella had reserved for her at the office, and aside from the purpose which was rapidly taking shape in her mind, she enjoyed the play very much. Stella Larue, as the grass widow, played her part with a piquancy which Constance knew was not wholly a matter of book knowledge. As the curtain went down, the audience, its appetite for the risque whetted, filed out on Broadway with its myriad lights and continuous film of motion. Constance made her way around to Stella's dressing room. She had scarcely been welcomed by Stella, whose cheeks beneath the grease paint were now genuinely ablaze with excitement, when a man entered. He was tall, spare, the type whose very bow is ingratiating and whose "delighted, I assure you" is suave and compelling. Alfred Warrington seemed to be on very good terms indeed with Stella as she introduced him to Constance. "You will join us, Mrs. Dunlap?" he asked, throwing an opera cloak over Stella's shoulders. "Vera Charmant and Jack Braden are waiting for us at the Little Montmartre." As he mentioned the famous cabaret, Constance took a little tighter grip on herself and decided to take the plunge and see the affair out, although that sort of thing had very little attraction for her. They were leaving the theater when she saw lurking in the crowd the familiar figure of Drummond. She turned her head quickly and sank back into the dark recesses of the limousine. Should she tell them now about him? She leaned over to Warrington. "I saw a man in the crowd just now who seemed to be quite interested in us," she said quickly. "Can't we drive around a bit to throw him off if he should get into a cab?" Warrington looked at her keenly. It was quite evident that he thought it was Constance who was being followed, not Stella or himself. Constance decided quickly to say nothing more that would prejudice Stella, but as Warrington directed his driver to run up through the park, she saw that, far from alarming him, the words had only added a zest of mystery about herself. They left the park, and the car jolted them quickly now over the uneven asphalt to the Palace of Pleasure, where already the two advance guards were holding one of the best tables in a house crowded with all classes, from debutantes to debauchees. Diamond Jack Braden was a heavy-set man with a debonair, dapper way about him. He wore a flower in his buttonhole, a smart touch which seemed very fetching, evidently, to the artistic Vera. Constance fell to studying him, as she did all men and women. "His hands betray him," she said to herself, as she was introduced. They were in fact shielded from view as he bowed, one with the thumb tucked in the corner of his trousers pocket, the other behind his back. He is hiding something, flashed through her mind intuitively, and when she analyzed it, she felt still that there was nothing fanciful about the idea. It was simply a little unconscious piece of evidence. From the start, the cabaret was pretty rapid. When they entered, two of the performers were rendering the Apache dance with an abandon that improved on its namesake. Scarcely had they finished when the orchestra began all over again, and a couple of diners from the tables glided past them on the dancing floor, then another couple and another. "Tangez-vous?" bowed Braden, leaning over to Stella. "Oui, je tangerai," she nodded, catching the spirit of the place. It left Warrington and Constance at the table with Vera, and as Constance looked eagerly after the graceful form of the little actress, Warrington asked, "Will you dance?" "No, thank you," she said, trying him out. "I haven't had time to learn these new steps. And besides, I've had a bad day in the market. Steel, Reading, everything is off. Not that I have lost much, but it's what I haven't made." Warrington, who had been about to repeat his question to Vera, turned suddenly. This was something new to him, to meet a woman like Constance. If she knew about other stocks, she must know about the syndicate. Already he had felt an attraction toward Constance physically, an attraction of maturity which somehow or other seemed more satisfying, at least novel, in contrast with the gay butterfly talk of Stella. He did not ask Vera to dance. Instead, he began banteringly to discuss Wall Street, and in 5 minutes he found out that she really knew as much about certain features of the game as he did. She did not need to be told that Alfred Warrington, plunger, man about town, was quite unexpectedly struck by her personality. Now and then she could see Stella eyeing her covertly. The little actress had had, like many another, a few dollars to invest, or rather with which to speculate. Her method had been usually to make a quick profit on a tip from some Wall Street friend. Often, if the tip went wrong, the friend would return the money to the unsuspecting little girl, with some muttered apology about having been unable to get it placed in time. And then, as the market went down or up, seeing that it was too late, adding a congratulation that at least the principal was saved if there was no profit. The little actress was plainly piqued. She saw, though she did not understand, that Constance was a different kind of plunger from what she had thought at first up at Charmant's. Instead of trying to compete with Constance in her field, she redoubled her efforts in her own. Was Warrington a live spender to slip through her grasp for a chance acquaintance? Another dance. This time it was Stella and Warrington. Braden, who had served excellently as a foil to lead Warrington on when he had eyes for no one else, not even Vera, was left severely alone. Nothing was said, not an action done openly, but Constance, womanlike, could feel the contest in the air. And she felt just a little quiver when they sat down and Warrington resumed the conversation with her where he had left it. Even the daring cut of Stella's gown and the exaggerated proximity of her dainty person had failed this time. As they chatted gaily, Constance enjoyed her triumph to the full. Yes, she could see that Stella was violently jealous, but she intended that she should be. That was now a part of her plan as it shaped itself in her mind, since she had plunged, or perhaps better, had been dragged into the game. As the evening wore on and the dancing became more furious, Warrington seemed to catch the spirit of recklessness that was in the very air. He talked more recklessly, once in a while with a bitterness not aimed at any one in particular, but which passed among the others as blasé sarcasm of one who had seen much and to whom even the fastest was slow. But to Constance, as she tried to fathom him, it presented an entirely different interpretation. For example, she asked herself why had he been so ready, apparently, to transfer his interest from Stella? Was it because, having cut loose from the one feminine tie that morally bound him, he no longer felt any restraint in cutting loose from others? Was it the same spirit that had carried him on in the money game, having cut loose from one financial principle to let all go and to guide his course as close to the edge of things as he dared? There had been the same reckless bravado in the way he had urged on the driver of his car in the wild ride of the earlier evening, violating the speed laws yet succeeding in escaping the traffic squad. Warrington was a plunger, yet there was something about him that was different from others she had seen. Perhaps it was that he had a conscience, even though he had succeeded in detaching himself from it. And Stella, there was something different about her, too. Constance more than once was on the point of revising her estimate of the little actress. Was she, after all, wholly mercenary in her attitude towards Warrington? Was he merely a live spender whom she could not afford to lose? Or was she merely a beautiful, delicate creature, caught in the merciless maelstrom of the life into which she had been thrown? Did she realize the perilous position this all was placing her in? They were among the last to leave, and Vera and Braden offered to take Constance to her apartment in Braden's car, while Stella contrived prettily to take so much of Warrington's time with the wraps that by the time they were ready to go, the manner of the breaking up of the party was as she wanted it. In her final triumph, she could not help just an extra inflection on, "I hope I'll see you again at Vera's soon, my dear." All night, or at least all that was left of it, Constance tried to straighten out the whirl of her thoughts. With the morning she had an idea. Now, in a moment when the exhilaration of the gay life was at low ebb, she must see Stella. It was early yet, but Stella was not at her hotel when Constance cautiously called up the office to find out. Where was she? Constance drove around to Charmant's on the chance that she might be there. Vera greeted her a trifle coldly, she thought, but then this was not midnight at the Montmartre. No, Stella was not there, she said. But nevertheless, Constance decided to wait. "I'm all unstrung," confided Constance, with an assumed air of languor as she dropped into a chair. Charmant, as fresh as if she had just emerged from the proverbial bandbox, nodded knowingly. "A Turkish bath, massage, something to tone you up," she advised. With alert eyes, Constance went patiently through the process of freshening, first in the steamy hot room where she had met Stella the day before, then the deliciously cool shower, gentle massage, and all the rest. At one of the little white tables of the manicures she noticed a pretty, rather sad-faced little woman. There was something about her that attracted Constance's attention, although she could not have told exactly what it was. "You know her?" whispered Floretta, bursting with excitement. "No? Why," and here she paused and dropped her voice even lower, "that's Mrs. Warrington." "Not the—" "Yes," she nodded, "his wife. You know she comes here twice a week. We have to do some tall scheming to keep them apart. No, it's not vanity either. It's, well, you see, she's trying to get him back, to look like a sport." Constance thought of the hopeless fight so far which the little woman was waging to keep up with the dashing actress. Then she thought of Warrington, of last night, of how he had sought her so readily, it seemed, to leave even the other woman. Then Floretta's remark repeated itself mechanically. "We have to do some tall scheming to keep them apart." Was Stella here, after all? Mrs. Warrington was not a bad-looking woman, and in fact it was difficult to see how she expected to be improved by cosmetics that would lighten her complexion, bleaches that would flaxen her hair, tortures for this, that, and the other defect, real or imagined. Now, however, she was a creature of reinforcements, from her puffy masses of light hair to her French heels and embroidered stockings that showed through the slash in the drapery of her gown. Constance felt sorry for her, deeply sorry. The whole thing seemed not in keeping with her. She was a homemaker, not a butterfly. Was Warrington worth it all? Asked Constance of herself. At least she thinks so, flashed over her, as Mrs. Warrington rose and left the room, watchfully guided by Floretta to the next process in her course of beautification. Constance sank back luxuriously on the cushions of her chaise lounge. She longed to explore the beauty parlor, to leave the rest room and go down the narrow corridor, prying into the secrets of the little dressing rooms that opened into it. What did they conceal? Why had Vera seemed so distant? Was it the natural reaction of the morning after? Or was Stella really there, and was she keeping her away from Mrs. Warrington to prevent friction between two clients that would have been annoying to all? She could reach no conclusion, except that there was a feeling of luxurious well-being as she lolled back into the deep recesses of the lounge in the corner of the room, separated from the next room by a thin board partition. Suddenly, her attention was arrested by muffled voices on the other side of the partition. She strained her ears. She could not, of course, see the speakers or even recognize their voices, but they were a man and a woman. We must get the thing settled right away. She overheard the man's voice. You see how he is. Every new face attracts him. See how he took to that new one last night. Who knows what may happen? By and by, someone may come along and spoil all. Couldn't we use her? Asked the woman. No, you can't use that woman. She's too clever. But we must do something, right away, tonight if possible. A pause. How then? Another pause, and the whispered monosyllable. Dope. What? I have it here. Use a dozen of them. They can be snuffed as a powder, or it can be put in a drink. If you want more, see, I will put the bottle on this shelf, way back. No one will see it. Don't you think I ought to write a note, something that will be sure to get him up here? Yes, a line or two, as if in haste. There was a sound as of tearing a sheet of notepaper from a pad. Is that all right? Yes. And as soon as the market closes. There will be nothing done today. Tomorrow's the day. Tonight we must get him going, and in the meantime a meeting will be held. The plan arranged at the Prince Henry tonight. And then the smash. Between them all, he won't know what has struck him. All right. You had better go out as you came in. It's better that no one up here should suspect anything. The voices ceased. What did it mean? Constance rose and sauntered around into the next room. It was empty, but when she looked hastily up on the shelf, there was a bottle of white tablets, and on the table a pad of notepaper from which a sheet had been torn. She picked up the bottle gingerly. Who had touched it? Her mind was working quickly. Somewhere she had read of fingerprints, and the subject had interested her because the system had been introduced in banks, and she saw that it was going to become more and more important. But how did they get them in a case like this? She had read of some powder that adhered to the marks left by the sweat glands of the fingers. There was the talcum powder. Perhaps it would do. Quickly, she shook the box gently over the glass. Then she blew it off carefully. Clear, sharp, distinct. There were the imprints of fingers. But the paper. Talcum powder would not bring them out on that. It must be something black. A lead pencil. Eagerly she seized it, and with a little silver penknife whittled off the wood. Scrape, scrape, until she had a neat little pile of finely powdered graphite. Then she poured it on the paper, and taking the sheet daintily by the edges so that she would not mix her own fingerprints with the others, she rolled the powder back and forth. As she looked anxiously, she could see the little grains adhering to the paper. A fine camel's hair brush lay on the table for penciling. She took it deftly. It made her think of that first time when she painted the checks for Carlton. A lump came into her throat. There they were, the second pair of telltale prints. But what tale did they tell? Whose were they? Her reading on fingerprints had been very limited, but like everything she did, to the point. She studied those before her, traced out as best she could the loops, whorls, arches, and composites, even counted the ridges on some of them. It was not so difficult after all. She stopped in an uptown branch of her brokers in one of the hotels. The market was very quiet, and even the rubber syndicate seemed to be marking time. As she went out, she passed the telephone booths. Should she call up Warrington? Would he misinterpret it? What if he did? She was mistress of her own tongue. She need not say too much. Besides, if she were going on a fishing expedition, a telephone line was as good as any other, better than a visit. "This is Mrs. Dunlap," she said directly. "Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Dunlap? I have been intending to call you, but—" He paused and added, "You know we are having a pretty strenuous time down here." There was a genuine ring to the first part of his reply, but the rest of it trailed off into the old blasé tone. "I'm sorry," she replied. "I enjoyed last night so much." "Did you?" came back eagerly. Before he could add anything, she asked, "I suppose you are going to see Stella again this afternoon?" "Why, yes," he hesitated. "I think so." "Where? At Vera's?" she asked, adopting a tone not of curiosity, but of chiding him for seeing Stella instead of herself. The moment of hesitation, before he said that he didn't know, told her the truth. It was as good as a plain yes. For several moments they chatted. As she hung up the receiver after his deferential goodbye, Constance knew that she had gained a new angle from which to observe Warrington's character. He was intensely human, and he was in wrong. Here was a mess all around. The day wore on, yet brought no indecision as to what she would do, though it brought no solution as to how to do it. The inaction was worse than anything else. The last quotations had come in over the ticker, showing the syndicate stocks still unchanged. She left her brokers and sat for a few moments in the rotunda of the hotel, considering. She could stand it no longer. Whatever happened, she would run around to Charmant's. Some excuse would occur when she got there. As Constance alighted from the private elevator, a delicate scent of attar of roses smote lightly on her, and there was, if anything, a greater air of exotic warmth about the place. Everything, from the electric bulbs buried deep in the clusters of amber artificial flowers, to the bright green leaves on the dainty trellises, the little square-paned windows and white furniture, bespoke luxury. There was an inviting tone to it all. "I'm glad I've found you," began Constance to Stella, as though nothing had happened. "There's something I'd like to say to you, besides thanking you most kindly for the good time last—" "Is there anything I can do for you?" interrupted Madame Charmant in a business-like tone. "I am sure Miss Larue invited you last night because she thought you were lonely. She and Mr. Warrington, you know, are old friends." Charmant emphasized the remark to mean, "You trespassed on forbidden ground if you thought you could get him away." Constance seemed not to notice the implication. "There is something I'd like to say," she repeated gently. She picked up a little inking pad which lay on a mahogany secretary, which Vera used as an office desk. "If you will be so kind, Stella, as to place your fingers flat on this pad, never mind about the ink, call Floretta, she will wipe them off afterwards, and then on this piece of paper, I won't bother you further." Almost before she knew it, the little actress had placed her dainty white hand on the pad and then on the paper. Constance did the same to illustrate, then called Floretta. "If Vera will do as I have done," she said, offering her the pad and taking her hand. Charmant complied, and when Floretta arrived, her impressions were added to the others. "There's a man wishes to see you outside, Madame," said Floretta, wiping off the soiled fingertips. "Tell him to wait in the little room." Floretta opened the door to go out, and through it Constance caught sight of a familiar face. A moment later the man was in the room with them. It was Drummond, the same sneer, the same assurance in his manner. "So," he snarled at Constance, "you here?" "I seem to be here," she answered calmly. "Why?" "Never mind why," he blustered. "I knew you saw me the other night. I heard you tell him to hit it up so as to shake me. But I found out all right." "Found out what?" asked Constance coldly. "Say, that's about your style, isn't it? You always get in when it comes to trimming the good spenders, don't you?" "Mr. Drummond," she replied, "I don't care to talk to you." "You don't, hey? Well, perhaps when the time comes, you'll have to talk. How about that?" She was thinking rapidly. Was Mrs. Warrington preparing to strike a blow that would be the last impulse necessary to send the plunger down for the last time? She decided to take a chance, to temporize until someone else made a move. "I'd thank you to place your fingers on this pad," said Constance quietly. "I'm making a collection of these things." "You are you?" "Yes," she cut short. "And if my collection isn't large enough, I shall call up Mrs. Warrington and ask her to come over, too," she added significantly. Floretta entered again. "Please wipe the ink off Mr. Drummond's fingers," ordered Constance quietly, still holding out the pad. "Confound your impudence," he ground out, seizing the pad. "There. What do you mean by Mrs. Warrington? What has she to do with this? Have a care, Mrs. Dunlap. You're on the wrong track here and going the wrong way." "Mr. Warrington is," began Floretta. "Show him in, quick," demanded Constance, determined to bring the affair to a showdown on the spot. As the door swung open, Warrington looked at the group in unfeigned surprise. "Mr. Warrington," greeted Constance without giving any of the others a chance. "This morning I heard a little conversation up here. Floretta, will you go into the little room and on the top shelf you will find a bottle. Bring it here carefully. I have a sheet of paper also which I am going to show you. I had already seen the little woman, Mr. Warrington, whom you have treated so unjustly. She was here trying vainly to win you back by those arts which she thinks most appeal to you." Floretta returned with the bottle and placed it on the secretary beside Constance. "Someone took some tablets from this bottle and gave them to someone else who wrote on this paper," she resumed, bending first over the paper she had torn from the pad. "Ah, a loop with 12 ridges. another loop, a whirl, a loop. The marks on this paper correspond precisely with those made here just now by Vera Charmant herself." "You get out of here, quick," snarled Drummond, placing himself between the now furious Vera and Constance. "1 minute," replied Constance calmly. "I am sure Mr. Warrington is a gentleman, if you are not. Perhaps I have no fingerprints to correspond with those on the bottle. If not, I am sure that we can send for someone whose prints will do so." She was studying the bottle. "The other, however," she said slowly, to conceal her own surprise, "was a person who has been set to trail you and Stella, Mr. Warrington. A detective named Drummond." Suddenly the truth flashed over her. Drummond was not employed by Mrs. Warrington at all. Then by whom? By the directors? And the rest of these people? Grafters who were using Stella to bait the hook. Braden had gone over to them, had aided in plunging Warrington into the wild life until he could no longer play the business game as before. Charmant was his confederate, Drummond his witness. "Stella," said Constance, turning suddenly to the little actress, "Stella, they are using you. Diamond Jack and Vera using you to lead him on. Playing the game of the minority of the directors of the syndicate to get him out. There is to be a meeting of the directors tonight at the Prince Henry. He was to be in no condition to go. Are you willing to be mixed up in such a scandal?" Stella Larue was crying into a lace handkerchief. You are all against me," she sobbed. "What have I done?" "Nothing," soothed Constance, patting her shoulder. "As for Charmant and Drummond, they are tied up by these proofs," she added, tapping the papers with the prints, then picking them up and handing them to Warrington. "I think if the story were told to the directors at the Prince Henry tonight, with reporters waiting downstairs in the lobby, it might produce a quieting effect." Warrington was speechless. He saw them all against him. Vera, Braden, Stella, Drummond. "More than that," added Constance, "nothing that you can ever do can equal the patience, the faith of the little woman I saw here today. Slaving, yes, slaving for beauty. Here in my hand, in these scraps of paper, I hold your old life. Not part of it, but all of it," she emphasized. "You have your chance. Will you take it?" He looked up quickly at Stella Larue. She had risen impulsively and flung her arms about Constance. "Yes," he muttered huskily, taking the papers. "All of it." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8, Part 1 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Abductors. "Take care of me, please, please." A slip of a girl, smartly attired in a fur-trimmed dress and a chic little feather-tipped hat, hurried up to Constance Dunlap late one afternoon as she turned the corner below her apartment. "It isn't faintness or illness exactly, but it's all so hazy," stammered the girl breathlessly. "And I've forgotten who I am. I've forgotten where I live. And a man has been following me. Oh, ever so long." The weariness in the tone of the last words caused Constance to look more closely at the girl. Plainly, she was on the verge of hysterics. Tears were streaming down her pale cheeks, and there were dark rings under her eyes, suggestive of a haunting fear of something from which she fled. Constance was astounded for the moment. Was the girl crazy? She had heard of cases like this, but to meet one so unexpectedly was surely disconcerting. "Who has been following you?" asked Constance gently, looking hastily over her shoulder and seeing no one. "A man," exclaimed the girl, "but I think he has gone now." "Can't you think of your name?" urged Constance. "Try." "No," cried the girl. "No, I can't. I can't." "Or your address?" repeated Constance. "Try. Try hard." The girl looked vacantly about. "No," she sobbed. "It's all gone. All." Puzzled, Constance took her arm and slowly walked her up the street toward her own apartment, in the hope that she might catch sight of some familiar face or be able to pull herself together. But it was of no use. They passed a policeman who eyed them sharply. The mere sight of the blue-coated officer sent a shudder through the already trembling girl on her arm. Don't let them take me to a hospital. Don't." pleaded the girl in a hoarse whisper when they had passed the officer. I won't, assured Constance. Was that the man who was following you? No. Oh, no, sobbed the girl, nervously looking back. Who was he then? Asked Constance eagerly. The girl did not answer, but continued to look back wildly from time to time, although there was no doubt that, if he existed at all, the man had disappeared. Suddenly Constance realized that she had on her hands a case of aphasia, perhaps real, perhaps induced by a drug. At any rate, the fear of being sent away to an institution was so strong in the poor creature that Constance felt intuitively how disastrous to her might be the result of disregarding the obsession. She was in a quandary. What should she do with the girl? To leave her on the street was out of the question. She was now more helpless than ever. They had reached the door of the apartment. Gently, she led the trembling girl into her own home. But now the question of what to do arose with redoubled force. She hesitated to call a physician, at least yet, because his first advice would probably be to send the poor little stranger to the psychopathic ward of some hospital. Constance's eye happened to rest on the dictionary in her bookcase. Perhaps she might recall the girl's name to her, if she were not shamming, by reading over the list of women's names in the back of the book. It meant many minutes, perhaps hours, but then Constance reflected on what might have happened to the girl if she had chanced to appeal to someone who had not felt a true interest in her. It was worth trying. She would do it. Starting with A, she read slowly. Is your name Abigail? Down through Barbara, Camilla, Deborah, Edith, Faith, she read. Flora? She asked. The girl seemed to apprehend something, appear less blank. Florence? Persisted Constance. Oh, yes, she cried. That's it. That's my name. But as for the last name and the address, she was just as hazy as ever. Still, there was now something different about her. Florence? Florence what? Reiterated Constance patiently. There was no answer, but with the continued repetition it seemed as if some depth in her nature had been stirred. Constance could not help feeling that the girl had really found herself. She had risen and was facing Constance, both hands pressed to her throbbing temples as if to keep her head from bursting. Constance had assisted her off with her coat and hat, and now the sartorial wreck of her masses of blonde hair was apparent. I suppose, she cried incoherently, I'm just one of more of the thousands of girls who drop out of sight every year. Constance listened in amazement. As the spell of her influence seemed to calm the overwrought mind of the girl, there succeeded a hardness in her tone that was wholly out of keeping with her youth. There was something that breathed of a past where there should have been nothing but the thought of a future. Tell me why, soothed Constance, with an air that invited confidence. The girl looked up again and again passed her hand over her white forehead with its mass of tangled fallen hair. Somehow Constance felt a tingling sensation of sympathy in her heart. Impulsively, she put out her hand and took the cold, moist hand of the girl. Because, she hesitated, struggling now with reflooding consciousness. Because, I don't know, I thought, perhaps, she added, dropping her eyes, you could help me. She was speaking rapidly enough now. I think they have employed detectives to trace me. One of them is almost up with me. I'm afraid I can't slip out of the net again. And I won't go back to them. I can't. I won't. Go back to whom? Queried her friend. Detectives employed by whom? My folks, she answered quickly. Constance was surprised. Least of all had she expected that. Why won't you go home? She prompted as the girl seemed about to lapse into a sort of stolid reticence. Home, she repeated bitterly. Home? No one would believe my story. I couldn't go home now. They have made it impossible for me to go home. I mean, every newspaper has published my picture. There were headlines for days, and only by chance I was not recognized. She was sobbing now convulsively. If they had only let me alone, I might have gone back then. But now, after the newspapers and the search, never. And yet I am going to have revenge some day. When he least expects it, I am going to tell the truth and... She stopped. And what? Asked Constance. Tell the truth and then do a cowardly thing. I would... You would not, blazed Constance. There was no mistaking the meaning. Leave it to me. Trust me. I will help you. She pulled the girl down on the divan beside her. Why talk of suicide, mused Constance. You can plead this aphasia I have just seen. I know lots of newspaper women. We could carry it through so that even the doctors would help us. Remember, aphasia will do for a girl nowadays what nothing else can do. Aphasia, Florence repeated harshly. Call it what you like, weakness, anything. I loved that man. Not the one who followed me, another. I believed him, but he left me in a place, across in Brooklyn. They said I was a fool, that some other fellow, perhaps better, with more money, would take care of me. But I left. I got a place in a factory. Then someone in the factory became suspicious. I had saved a little. It took me to Boston. Again, someone grew suspicious. I came back here, the only place to hide. I got another position as waitress in the Betsy Ross tea room. There I was able to stay until yesterday. But then a man came in. He had been there before. He seemed too interested in me. Not in a way that others have been, but in me, my name. Somehow I suspected. I put on my hat and coat. I fled. I think he followed me. All night I have walked the streets and ridden in cars to get away from him. At last I appealed to you. The girl had sunk back into the soft pillows of the couch beside her new friend and hid her face. Softly Constance patted and smoothed the wealth of golden hair. You poor little girl, she sympathized. Then a film came over her own eyes. New York took me at a critical time in my own life, she said, more to herself than to the girl. She sheltered me, gave me a new start. What she did for me she will do for any other person who really wishes to make a fresh start in life. I made few acquaintances, no friends. Fortunately, the average New Yorker asks only that his neighbor leave him alone. No hermit could find better and more complete solitude than in the heart of this great city. Constance looked pityingly at the girl before her. Why can't you tell them, she suggested, that you wanted to be independent, that you went away to make your own living? But my father is well off, and they have this detective who follows me. He will find me some day, for the reward, and will tell the truth. The reward? Yes, $1,000. Don't you remember reading? The girl stopped short as if to check herself. You are Florence Gibbons? Gasped Constance, as with a rush there came over her the recollection of a famous unsolved mystery of several months before. The girl did not look up as Constance bent over and put her arms about her. Who was he? She asked persuasively. Preston, Lansing Preston, she sobbed bitterly. Only the other day I read of his engagement to a girl in Chicago. Beautiful, in society. Oh, I could kill him, she cried, throwing out her arms passionately. Think of it. He, rich, powerful, respected. I, poor, almost crazy, an outcast. Constance did not interfere until the tempest had passed. What name did you give at the tea room? Asked Constance. Viola Cole, answered Florence. Rest here, soothed Constance. Here at least you are safe. I have an idea. I shall be back soon. The Betsy Ross was still open after the rush of tired shoppers and later of business women to whom this was not only a restaurant but a club. Constance entered and sat down. Is the manager in? She asked of the waitress. Mrs. Palmer? No. But if you care to wait, I think she'll be back directly. As Constance sat toying absently with some food at one of the snowy white tables, a man entered. A man in a tea room is an anomaly, for the tea room is a woman's institution, run by women for women. Men enter with diffidence, and seldom alone. This man was quite evidently looking for someone. His eye fell on Constance. Her heart gave a leap. It was her old enemy, Drummond, the detective. For a moment he hesitated, then bowed and came over to her table. Peculiar places, these tea rooms, observed Drummond. Constance was doing some quick thinking. Could this be the detective Florence Gibbons had mentioned? The only thing lacking to make them complete, he rattled on, is a license. Now take those places that have a ladies' bar, that do openly what tea rooms do covertly. They don't reckon with the attitude of women. This is New York, not Paris. Such things are years off. I don't say they'll not come or that women won't use them, but not by that name, not yet. Constance wondered what his cynical inconsequentialities masked. "I think it adds to the interest," she observed, watching him furtively, "this evasion of the laws." Drummond was casting about for something to do, and naturally, to a mind like his, a drink was the solution. Evidently, however, there were degrees of brazenness, even in tea rooms. The Betsy Ross not only would not produce a labeled bottle and an obvious glass, but stoutly denied their ability to fill such an order, even whispered. "Russian tea?" suggested Drummond cryptically. "How will you have it, with Scotch or rye?" asked the waitress. "Bourbon," hazarded Drummond. When the "Russian tea" arrived, it was in a neat little pot with two others, the first containing real tea and the second hot water. It was served virtuously in teacups, so opaquely concealed that no one but the clandestine drinker could know what sort of poison was being served. Mrs. Palmer was evidently later than expected. Drummond fidgeted after the manner of a man out of his accustomed habitat, and yet he did not seem to be interested really in Constance or even in Mrs. Palmer, for after a few moments he rose and excused himself. How did he come here? Constance asked herself over and over. As far as she could reason it out, there could be only one reason. Drummond was clearly up with Florence. Did he also know that Constance was shielding her? The more she thought of it, the more she shuddered at the tactless way in which the detective would perform the act of charity by discovering the lost girl and pocketing the reward. If her family only knew how eagerly they might let her come back in her own way. She looked up the address of Everett Gibbons while she was waiting, a half-formed plan taking definite shape in her mind. What she did must be done quickly. Here at the tea room, at least, Florence, or rather Viola, was known. Perhaps the best way, after all, was to let her be discovered here. They could not deny that she had been working for them acceptably for some time. Half an hour later, Mrs. Palmer, a bustling businesswoman, came in, and the waitress pointed her out to Constance. "Did you have a waitress here named Viola Cole?" began Constance, watching keenly the effect of her inquiry. "Yes," replied Mrs. Palmer, in a tone of interest that reassured Constance that, if there were any connection between Drummond's presence and Mrs. Palmer, it was wholly on his seeking. "But she disappeared last night. A most peculiar girl, but a splendid worker." "She has been ill," Constance hastened to explain. "I am a friend of hers. I have a business downtown and could not come around until tonight to tell you that she will be back tomorrow if you will take her back." "Of course I'll take her back. I'm sorry she's ill." And Mrs. Palmer bustled out into the kitchen, not unfeelingly, but merely because that was her manner. Constance paid her check and left the tea room. So far, she had succeeded. The next thing she had planned was a visit to Mr. Gibbons. That need not take long, for she was not going to tell anything. Her idea was merely to pave the way. End of Part 1 of Chapter 8. Chapter 8, Part 2 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Abductors continued. The Gibbons, she found, lived in a large house on one of the numerous side streets from the park, in a neighborhood that was in fact something more than merely well-to-do. Fortunately, she found Everett Gibbons in and was ushered into his study, where he sat poring over some papers and enjoying an after-dinner cigar. "Mr. Gibbons," began Constance, "I believe there is a $1,000 reward for news of the whereabouts of your daughter, Florence." "Yes," he said in a colorless tone that betrayed the hopelessness of the long search. "But we have traced down so many false clues that we have given up hope. Since the day she went away, we have never been able to get the slightest trace of her. Still, we welcome outside aid." "Of detectives?" she asked. "Official and private. Paid and volunteer. Anybody," he answered. "I myself have come to the belief that she is dead, for that is the only explanation I can think of for her long silence." "She is not dead," replied Constance in a low tone. "Not dead?" he repeated eagerly, catching at even such a straw as an unknown woman might cast out. "Then you know—" "No," she interrupted positively. "I cannot tell you any more. You must call off all other searchers. I will let you know." "When?" "Tomorrow, perhaps the next day. I will call you on the telephone." She rose and made a hasty adieu before the man who had been prematurely aged might overwhelm her with questions and break down her resolution to carry the thing through as she had seen best. Cheerily, Constance turned the key in the lock of her door. There was no light, and somehow the silence smote on her ominously. "Florence!" she called. There was no answer. Not a sign indicated her presence. There was the divan with the pillows disarranged as they had been when she left. The furniture was in the same position as before. Hastily she went from one room to another. Florence had disappeared. She went to the door again. All seemed right there. If anyone had entered, it must have been because he was admitted, for there were no marks to indicate that the lock had been forced. She called up the tea room. Mrs. Palmer was very sympathetic, but there had been no trace of Viola Cole there yet. "You will let me know if you get any word?" asked Constance anxiously. "Surely," came back Mrs. Palmer's cordial reply. 100 dire possibilities crowded through her mind. Might Florence be held somewhere as a white slave, not by physical force, but by circumstances, ignorant of her rights, afraid to break away again? Or was it suicide, as she had threatened? She could not believe it. Nothing could have happened in such a short time to change her resolution about revenge. The recollection of all the stories she had read recently crossed her mind. Could it be a case of drugs? The girl had given no evidence of being a dope fiend. Perhaps someone had entered after all. She thought of the so-called poisoned needle cases. Might she not have been spirited off in that way? Constance had doubted the stories. She knew that almost any doctor would say that it was impossible to inject a narcotic by a sudden jab of a hypodermic syringe. That was rather a slow, careful, and deliberate operation to be submitted to with patience. Yet Florence was gone. Suddenly it flashed over Constance that Drummond might not be seeking the reward primarily, after all. His first object might be shielding Preston. She recollected that Mr. Gibbons had said nothing about Drummond, either one way or the other. And if he were both shielding Preston and working for the reward, he would care little how much Florence suffered. He might be playing both ends to serve himself. She rang the elevator bell. "Has anybody called at my apartment while I was out?" she asked. "Yes'm, a man came here." "And you let him up?" "I didn't know you were out. You see, I had just come on. He said he was to meet someone at your apartment, and when he pressed the buzzer, the door opened, and I ran the elevator down again. I thought it was all right, ma'am." "And then what?" inquired Constance breathlessly. "Well, in about 5 minutes, my bell rang. I ran the elevator up again, and waiting was this man with a girl I had never seen before. You understand, I thought it was all right. He told me he was going to meet someone." Yes, I understand. Oh, my God. If I had only thought to leave word not to let her go. How did she look?" "Her clothes, you mean, ma'am?" "No, her face, her eyes." "Begging your pardon. I thought she was, acted queer. Scared. Dazed like." "You didn't notice which way they went, I suppose?" "No, ma'am, I didn't." Constance turned back again into her empty apartment, heartsick. In spite of all she had planned and done, she was defeated. Worse than defeated. Where was Florence? What might not happen to her? She could have sat down and cried. Instead, she passed a feverishly restless night. All the next day passed, and still not a word. She felt her own helplessness. She could not appeal to the police. That might defeat the very end she sought. She was single-handed. For all she knew, she was fighting the almost limitless power of brains and money of Preston. Inquiry developed the fact that Preston himself was reported to be in Chicago with his fiancée. Time and again she was on the point of making the journey to let him know that someone, at least, was watching him. But, she reflected, if she did that she might miss the one call from Florence for help. Then she thought bitterly of the false hope she had raised in the despairing father of Florence Gibbons. It was maddening. Several times during the day Constance dropped into the Betsy Ross without finding any word. Late that night the buzzer on her door sounded. It was Mrs. Palmer herself, with a letter at last, written on rough paper in pencil with a trembling hand. Constance almost literally pounced on it. "Will you tell the lady who was so kind to me that while she was out seeing you at the tea room, there was a call at her door? I didn't like to open it, but when I asked who was there, a man said it was the steam fitter she had asked to call about the heat. I opened the door. From that moment when I saw his face until I came to myself here, I remember nothing. I would write to her, only I don't know where she lives. One of the bellboys here is kind enough to smuggle this note out for me, addressed to the Betsy Ross. Tell her, please, that I am at a place in Brooklyn, I think called Lustgarten's. She can recognize it because it is at a railroad crossing. Steam railroads, not trolleys or elevateds. I know you think me crazy, Mrs. Palmer, but the other lady can tell you about it. Oh, it was the same horrible feeling that came over me that night as before. It isn't a dream. It's more like a trance. It comes in a second, usually when I am frightened. I suddenly feel nervous and shaky. I can't tell what is going on around me. I lose my hearing. Part of the time it is as though I had a paralytic stroke of the tongue. The next day, perhaps, it is gone. But while it lasts, it is terrifying. It is like walking into a new world, with everybody, everything strange about me. The note ended with a most pathetic appeal. Constance was already nervously putting on her hat. You are going to go there? Asked Mrs. Palmer. If I can locate the place, she answered. Aren't you afraid? Inquired the other. Constance did not reply. She ostentatiously slipped a little ivory-handled revolver into her handbag. It's a new one, she explained finally. Like nothing you've ever heard of before, I guess. I bought it only the other day after a friend of mine told me about it. Mrs. Palmer was watching her closely. You are a good woman, she burst out finally. It isn't good business. It isn't good sense. Constance stopped short in her preparations for the search. What are business and sense compared to the life of... She checked herself on the very point of revealing the girl's real name. Nothing, replied Mrs. Palmer. I had already made up my mind to go with you before I spoke, if you will let me. In a moment the two understood each other better than after years of casual acquaintance. Back and forth through the mazes of streets and car lines of the city across the river the two women traveled, asking veiled questions of every wearer of a uniform, until at last they found such a place as Florence had described in her note. There, it seemed, had sprung up a little center of vice. While reformers were trying to clamp down tight the lid in New York, all the vicious elements were prying it up here. Crushed in one place, they rose again in another. There was the electric sign, Lustgarten. Even a cursory glance told them that it included a saloon on the first floor with a sort of dance hall and second-rate cabaret. Above that was a hotel. The windows were darkened, with awnings pulled down, even on what must have been in the daytime the shady side. Shall we go in? Are you game? Asked Constance of her companion. I haven't gone so far without considering that, replied Mrs. Palmer, somewhat reproachfully. Without a word, Constance entered the door down the street, followed by her companion. A Negro at the little cubbyhole of an office pushed out a register at them. Constance signed the first names that came into her head, and a moment later they were on their way up to a big double room on the third floor, led by another, younger Negro. Will you send the bellboy up? Asked Constance as they entered the room. I'm the bellboy, ma'am, was his disconcerting reply. I meant the other one, replied Constance, hazarding. The one who is here in the daytime. There ain't no other boy, ma'am. There ain't no... Could you deliver a note for me at a tea room in New York tomorrow? Interrupted Constance, striking while the iron seemed hot. The boy turned around abruptly from his busy occupation of doing something useless that would elicit a tip. He quietly shut the door and wheeled about with his hand still on the knob. Do you want to know what room she's in? He asked. Constance opened her handbag. Mrs. Palmer suppressed a little scream. She had expected that ivory-handled thing to appear. Instead, there was a treasury note of a size that caused the white part of the boy's eyes to expand beyond all the laws of optics. Yes, she said, pressing it into his hand. 42, down the hall, around the turn, on the other side, whispered the boy. And for God's sake, ma'am, don't tell nobody I told you. His shuffle down the hall had scarcely ceased before the two women were stealthily creeping in the opposite direction, looking eagerly at the numbers. Constance had stopped abruptly around the turn. Through a transom of one of the rooms, they could hear voices, but could see no light. Well, go back then, growled a gruff voice. Your family will never believe your story. Never believe that you came again and stayed at Lustgarten's against your will. Why, the voice taunted with a harsh laugh, if they knew the truth. they would turn you from the door instead of offering a reward." There was a moment of silence. Then a woman's voice, strangely familiar to Constance, spoke. "The truth," she exclaimed bitterly. "He knew it was a case of a girl who liked a good time, liked pretty clothes, a ride in an automobile, theaters, excitement, bright lights, night life, a girl with a romantic disposition in whom all that was repressed at home. He knew it," she replied, raising the tone to an almost hysterical pitch, "led me on, made me love him because he could give them all to me. And when I began to show the strain of the pace, they all show it more than the men, he cast me aside like a squeezed-out lemon." As she listened, Constance understood it all now. It was to make Florence Gibbons a piece of property, a thing to be traded in, bartered. That was the idea. Discover her, yes, but first to thrust her into the life if she would not go into it herself. Anything to discredit her testimony beforehand, anything to save the precious reputation of one man. "Well," shouted the other voice menacingly, "do you want to know the truth? Haven't you read it often enough? Instead of hoping you will return, they pray that you are dead." He hissed the words out, then added, "They prefer to think that you are dead. Why, damn it, they turn to that belief for comfort." Constance had seized Mrs. Palmer by the arm, and acting in concert, they threw both their weights against the thin wooden door. It yielded with a crash. Inside, the room was dark. Indistinctly, Constance could make out two figures, one standing, the other seated in a deep rocker. A suppressed exclamation of surprise was followed by a hasty lunge of the standing figure toward her. Constance reached quickly into her handbag and drew out the little ivory-handled pistol. Bang! It spat almost into the man's face. Choking, sputtering, the man groped a minute blindly, then fell on the floor and frantically tried to rise again and call out. The words seemed to stick in his throat. You shot him?" gasped a woman's voice, which Constance now knew was Florence's. "With the new German Secret Service gun," answered Constance quietly, keeping it leveled to cow any assistance that might be brought. "It blinds and stupefies without killing. A bulletless revolver intended to check and render harmless the criminal instead of maiming him. The cartridges contain several chemicals that combine when they are exploded and form a vapor which blinds a man and puts him out. No one wants to kill such a person as this." She reached over and switched on the lights. The man on the floor was Drummond himself. "You will tell your real employer, Mr. Preston," she added contemptuously, "that unless he agrees to our story of his elopement with Florence, marries her, and allows her to start an undefended action for divorce, we intend to make use of the new Federal Mann Act, with a jail sentence for both of you." Drummond looked up sullenly, still blinking and choking. "And not a word of this until the suit is filed. Then we will see the reporters, not he. Understand?" "Yes," he muttered, still clutching his throat. An hour later, Constance was at the telephone in her own apartment. "Mr. Gibbons, I must apologize for troubling you at this late or rather early hour, but I promised you something which I could not fulfill until now. This is the Mrs. Dunlap who called on you the other day with a clue to your daughter, Florence. I have found her, yes, working as a waitress in the Betsy Ross tea room. No, not a word to anyone, not even to her mother. No, not a word. You can see her tomorrow at my apartment. She is going to live with me for a few days until we can get a few little matters straightened out." Constance had jammed the receiver back on the hook hastily. Florence Gibbons, wild-eyed, trembling, imploring, had flung her arms about her neck. "No, no, no," she cried. "I can't. I won't." With a force that was almost masculine, Constance took the girl by both shoulders. "The $1,000 reward which comes to me," said Constance decisively, "will help us straighten out those few little matters with Preston. Mrs. Palmer can stretch the time which you have worked for her." Something of Constance's will seemed to be infused into Florence Gibbons by force of suggestion. "And remember," said Constance in a tense voice, "for anything after your elopement, it's aphasia, aphasia, aphasia." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Shoplifters. Madam, would you mind going with me for a few moments to the office on the third floor? Constance Dunlap had been out on a shopping excursion. She had stopped at the jewelry counter of Stacy's to have a ring repaired and had gone on to the leather goods department to purchase something else. The woman who spoke to her was a quietly dressed young person, quite inconspicuous, with a keen eye that seemed to take in everything within a radius of a wide-angled lens at a glance. She leaned over, and before Constance could express even surprise, added in a whisper, "Look in your bag." Constance looked hastily, then realized what had happened. The ring was gone. It gave her quite a shock, too, for the ring, a fine diamond, was a present from her husband, one of the few pieces of jewelry treasured not only for its intrinsic value, but as a remembrance of Carlton and the supreme sacrifice he had made for her. She had noticed nothing in the crowd, nothing more than she had noticed scores of times before. The woman watched her puzzled look. "I've been following you," she said. "By this time the other store detectives must have caught the shoplifter and bag opener who touched you. You see, we don't make any arrests in the store if we can help it, because we don't like to make a scene. It's bad for business. Besides, if she had anything else, we are safer when the case comes to court, if we have caught her actually leaving the store with it. Of course, when we make an arrest on the sidewalk, we bring the shoplifter back, but in a private back elevator." Constance was following the young woman mechanically. At least there was a chance of recovering the ring. "She was standing next to you at the jewelry counter," she continued, "and if you will help identify her, the store management will appreciate it and make it worth your while. Besides," she urged, "it's really your duty to do it, madam." Constance remembered now the rather simply but richly gowned young woman who had been standing next to her at the counter, seemingly unable to decide which of a number of beautiful rings she really wanted. She remembered because, with her own love of beauty, she had wanted one herself, in fact had thought at the time that she too might have difficulty in choosing. With the added feeling of curiosity, Constance followed the woman detective up in the elevator. In the office, apart in a little room curiously furnished with a camera, innumerable photographs, cabinets, and filing cases, was a young woman, perhaps 26 or 7. On a table before her lay a pile of laces and small trinkets. There, too, was the beautiful diamond ring which she had hidden in her muff. Constance fairly gasped at the sight. The girl was sitting limply in a chair, crying bitterly. She was not a hardened-looking creature. In fact, her face bore evident traces of refinement, and her long, slender fingers hinted at a nervous, artistic temperament. It was rather a shock to see such a girl under such distressing circumstances. "We've lost so much lately," a small ferret-eyed man was saying, "that we must make an example of someone. It's serious for us detectives, too. We'll lose our jobs unless we can stop you boosters." "Oh, I didn't mean to do it. I just couldn't help it," sobbed the girl over and over again. "Yes," drawled the man, "that's what they all say. But you've been caught with the goods this time, young lady." A woman entered, and the man turned to her quickly. "Carr. Kitty Carr. Did you find anything under that name?" "No, sir," replied the woman store detective. "We've looked all through the records and the photographs. We don't find her. And yet I don't think it is an alias. At least, if it is, not an alias for any one we have any record of. I've a good eye for faces, and there isn't one we have on file as good-looking," she added, perhaps with a little touch of wistfulness at her own plainness and this beauty gone wrong. "This is the woman who lost the ring," put in the other woman detective, motioning to Constance, who had accompanied her and was standing, a silent spectator. The man held up the ring, which Constance had already recognized. "Is that yours?" he asked. For a moment, strangely, she hesitated. If it had been any other ring in the world, she felt sure that she would have said no. But then, she reflected, there was that pile of stuff. There was no use in concealing her ownership of the ring. "Yes," she murmured. "One moment, please," answered the man brusquely. "I must send down for the salesgirl who waited on you to identify you and your check. A mere formality, you know, but necessary to keep things straight." Constance sat down. "I suppose you don't realize it," explained the man, turning to Constance, "but the shoplifters of the city get away with a couple of $1 million worth of stuff every year. It's the price we have to pay for displaying our goods, but it's too high. They are the department store's greatest unsolved problem. Now, most of the stores are working together for their common interests, seeing what they can do to root them out. We all keep a sort of private rogues gallery of them. But we don't seem to have anything on this girl, nor have any of the other stores who exchange photographs and information with us anything on her." "Evidently, then, it is her first offense," put in Constance, wondering at herself. Strangely, she felt more of sympathy than of anger for the girl. "You mean the first time she's been caught at it," corrected the head of the store detectives. "It is my weakness," sobbed the girl. "Sometimes an irresistible impulse to steal comes over me. I just can't help it." She was sobbing convulsively. As she talked and listened, there seemed to come a complete breakdown. She wept as though her heart would break. "Oh," exclaimed the man, "can it? Cut out the sob stuff." "And yet," mused Constance half to herself, watching the girl closely, "when one walks through the shops and sees thousands of dollars' worth of goods lying unprotected on the counters, is it any wonder that some poor woman or girl should be tempted and fall? There, before her eyes and within her grasp, lies the very article above all others which she so ardently craves. No one is looking. The salesgirl is busy with another customer. The rest is easy. And then the store detective steps in, and here she is, captured." The girl had been listening wildly through her tears. "Oh," she sobbed, "you don't understand. None of you. I don't crave anything. I just can't help it. And then afterwards, I hate the stuff. And I am so afraid. I hurry home, and oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" Constance pitied her deeply. She looked from the wild-eyed, tear-stained face to the miscellaneous pile of material on the table and the unwinking gaze of the store detectives. True, the girl had taken a very valuable diamond ring, and from herself. But the laces, the trinkets, all were abominably cheap, not worth risking anything for. Constance's attention was recalled by the man who beckoned her aside to talk to the salesgirl who had waited on her. "You remember seeing this lady at the counter?" he asked of the girl. She nodded. "And that woman in there?" he motioned. Again the salesgirl nodded. "Do you remember anything else that happened?" he asked Constance as they faced Kitty Carr, and he handed Constance the ring. Constance looked the detective squarely in the face for a moment. "I have my ring. You have the other stuff," she murmured. "Besides, there is no record against her. She doesn't even look like a professional bad character. No, I'll not appear to press the charge. I'll make it as hard as I can before I'll do it," she added positively. The woman, who had overheard, looked her gratitude. The detectives were preparing to argue. Constance hardly knew what she was saying as she hurried on before anyone else could speak. "No," she added, "but I'll tell you what I will do. If you will let her go, I will look after her, parole her unofficially with me." Constance drew a card from her case and handed it to the detective. He read it carefully, and a puzzled look came over his face. "Charge account, good customer, pays promptly," he muttered under his breath. For a moment he hesitated. Then he sat down at a desk. "Mrs. Dunlap," he said, "I'll do it." He pulled a piece of printed paper from the desk, filled in a few blanks, then turned to Kitty Carr, handing her a pen. "Sign here," he said brusquely. Constance bent over and read. It was a form of release. "I, Kitty Carr, residing at East Street, single, age 27 years, in consideration of the sum of $1, hereby admit taking the following property, without having paid therefor, and with intent not to pay therefor, and by reason of the withdrawal of the complaint of larceny, of which I am guilty, I hereby remise, release, and forever discharge the said Stacy Company or its representatives from any claims, action, or causes of action which I may have against the Stacy Company or its representatives or agents by reason of the withdrawal of said charge of larceny and failure to prosecute. Signed, Kitty Carr." "Now, Kitty," soothed Constance as the trembling signature was blotted and added to a photograph which had quietly been taken, "they are going to let you go this time, with me. Come, straighten your hat, wipe your eyes. You must take me home with you, where we can have a nice long talk. Remember, I am your friend." On the way uptown and across the city, the girl managed to tell most of her history. She came from a family of means in another city. Her father was dead, but her mother and a brother were living. She herself had a small annuity, sufficient to live on modestly, and had come to New York seeking a career as an artist. Her story, her ambitions, appealed to Constance, who had been somewhat of an artist herself, and recognized even in talking to the girl that she was not without some ability. Then, too, she found that Kitty actually lived, as she had said, in a cozy little kitchenette apartment with 2 friends, a man and his wife, both of whom happened to be out when they arrived. As Constance looked about, she could see clearly that there was indeed no adequate reason why the girl should steal. "How do you feel?" asked Constance, when the girl had sunk half exhausted on a couch in the living room. "Oh, so nervous," she replied, pressing her hands to the back of her head. "And I have a terrible headache, although it is a little better now." They had talked for perhaps half an hour, as Constance soothed her, when there was the sound of a key in the door. A young woman in black entered. She was well dressed, in fact elegantly dressed in a quiet way, somewhat older than Kitty, but by no means as attractive. "Why, hello, Kitty," she cried. "What's the matter?" "Oh, Annie, I'm so unstrung," replied the girl. Then, recollecting Constance, added, "Let me introduce my friend, Mrs. Dunlap. This is Mrs. Annie Grayson, who has taken me in as a lodger and is ever so kind to me." Constance nodded, and the woman held out her hand frankly. "Very glad to meet you," she said. "My husband, Jim, is not at home, but we are a very happy little family up here. Why, Kitty, what is the matter?" The girl had turned her face down in the sofa pillows and was sobbing again. Between sobs, she blurted out the whole of the sordid story, and as she proceeded, Annie glanced quickly from her to Constance for confirmation. Suddenly she rose and extended her hand to Constance. "Mrs. Dunlap," she said, "how can I ever thank you for what you have done for Kitty? She is almost like a sister to me. You were too good." There was a little catch in the woman's voice, but Constance could not quite make out whether it was acted or wholly genuine. "Did she ever do anything like that before?" she asked. "Only once," replied Annie Grayson, "and then I gave her such a talking to that I thought she would be able to restrain herself when she felt that way again." It was growing late, and Constance recollected that she had an engagement for the evening. As she rose to go, Kitty almost overwhelmed her with embraces. "I'll keep in touch with Kitty," whispered Constance at the door, "and if you will let me know when anything comes up that I may help her in, I shall thank you." "Depend on me," answered Mrs. Grayson, "and I want to add my thanks to Kitty's for what you have done. I'll try to help you." As she groped her way down the as yet unlighted stairs, Constance became aware of 2 men talking in the hall. As she passed them, she thought she recognized one of the voices. She lowered her head, and fortunately her thin veil in the half light did the rest. She passed unnoticed and reached the door of the apartment. As she opened it, she heard the men turn and mount the stairs. Instinctively she realized that something was wrong. One of the men was her old enemy, Drummond, the detective. They had not recognized her, and as she stood for a moment with her hand on the knob, she tried to reason it out. Then she crept back and climbed the stairs noiselessly. Voices inside the apartment told her that she had not been mistaken. It was the apartment of the Graysons and Kitty that they sought. The hall door was of thin, light wood, and as she stood there she could easily hear what passed inside. "What, is Kitty ill?" she heard the strange man's voice inquire. "Yes," replied Mrs. Grayson. Then her voice trailed off into an indistinguishable whisper. "How are you, Kitty?" asked the man. "Oh, I have a splitting headache, Jim. I've had it all day. I could just get up and screech." "I'm sorry. I hope it gets better soon." "Oh, I guess it will. They often go away as suddenly as they come. You know I've had them before." Drummond's voice then spoke up. "Did you see the Trimble ad tonight?" he asked evidently of Annie. "They have a lot of new diamonds from Arkansas, they say. One of them is a big one. The Arkansas Queen, I believe they call it." "No, I didn't see the papers," replied Annie. There was the rustle of a newspaper. "Here's a picture of it. It must be great. I've heard a good deal about it." "Have you seen it?" asked Annie.
"No, but I intend to see it."
They had passed into the next room, and Constance, fearing to be discovered, decided to get away before that happened. End of part 1 of chapter 9. Chapter 9, Part 2 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Shoplifters continued. Early the next morning she decided to call on Kitty, but by the time Constance arrived at the apartment it was closed, and a neighbor informed her that the two women had gone out together about half an hour before. Constance was nervous, and as she left the apartment she did not notice that a man who had been loitering about had quickened his pace and overtaken her.
"So," drawled the voice, "you're traveling with shoplifters now."
She looked up quickly. This time she had run squarely into Drummond. There was no concealment possible now. Her only refuge was silence. She felt the hot tingle of indignation in her cheeks, but she said nothing.
"Huh,"
exclaimed Drummond, walking along beside her and adding contemptuously,
"I don't know the young one, but you know who the other is?"
Constance bit her lip. "No?" he queried.
"Then I'll show you."
He had taken from his pocket a bunch of oblong cards. Each bore, she could see from the corner of her eye, a full face and a profile picture of a woman, and on the back of the card was a little writing. He selected one and handed it to Constance. Instantly she recognized the face. It was Annie Grayson, with half a dozen aliases written after the name.
"There,"
he fairly snorted.
"That's the sort of people your little friend consorts with. Why, they call Annie Grayson the queen of the shoplifters. She has forgotten more about shoplifting than all the rest will ever know."
Constance longed to ask him what had taken him to the Grayson flat the night before, but thought better of it. There was no use in angering Drummond further. Instead, she let him think that he had succeeded in frightening her off. She went back to her own apartment to wait and worry. Evidently, Drummond was pretty sure of something, or he would not have disclosed his hand to her, even partially. She felt that she must see Kitty before it was too late. Then the thought crossed her mind that perhaps already it was too late. Drummond evidently was working in some way for an alliance of the department stores outside. Constance had had her own ideas about Kitty, and as she waited and watched she tried to reason how she might carry them out if she had a chance. She had just been insured and had been very much interested in the various tests that the woman doctor of the insurance company had applied to her. One in particular, which involved the use of a little simple instrument that fitted over the forearm, had interested her particularly. She had talked to the doctor about it, and as she talked an idea had occurred to her that it might have other uses than those which the doctor made of it. She had bought one. While she was waiting it occurred to her that perhaps it might serve her purpose. She got the instrument out. It consisted of a little arrangement that fitted over the forearm and was attached by a tube to a dial that registered in millimeters a column of mercury. Would it really show anything, she wondered? There was a quick call on the telephone, and she answered it, her hand trembling, for she felt sure that it was something about the little woman she had befriended. Somehow or other her voice hardened as she answered the call and found that it was from Drummond. It would never do to betray even nervousness before him.
"Your friend, Miss Carr," shot out Drummond with brutal directness, "has been caught again. She fell into something as neatly as if she had really meant to do it. Yesterday, you know, Trimble's advertised the new diamond, the Arkansas Queen, on exhibition. Well, it was made of paste anyway, but it was a perfect imitation. But that didn't make any difference. We caught Kitty just now trying to lift it. I'm sorry it wasn't the other one, but small fry are better than none. We'll get her too yet. Besides, I find this Kitty has a record already at Stacy's." He added the last words with a taunting sneer. Constance realized suddenly the truth. The whole affair had been a plant of Drummond's. "You are at Trimble's?" she inquired quickly. "Well, can you wait there just a few minutes? I'd like to see Miss Carr." Drummond promised. His acquiescence in itself boded no good, but nevertheless she decided to go. As she left her apartment hurriedly, she picked up the little instrument and dropped it into her handbag. "You see, it's no use,"
almost chortled Drummond, as Constance stepped off the elevator and opened the door to a little room at Trimble's, much like that which she had already seen at Stacy's.
"A shoplifter becomes habitual after 25. They get to consorting with others of their kind."
Kitty was sitting rigidly motionless in a chair, staring straight ahead, as Constance entered. She gave a start at the sight of a familiar face, rose, and would almost have fainted if Constance had not caught her. It seemed as if something had snapped in the girl's makeup. For the first time, tears came. Constance patted her hand softly. The girl was an enigma. Was she a clever actress, 1 minute hardened Miss Sophisticated, the next appealing Miss Innocence? "How did you catch her?" asked Constance a moment later, as she found an opportunity to talk to Drummond alone. "Oh, she was trying to substitute a paste replica for the alleged Arkansas Queen. The clerk noticed the replica in time, saw a little spot of carbon on it, and she was shadowed and arrested just as she was leaving the store. Yes, they found the other paste jewel on her. She was caught with the goods." "Replica," repeated Constance, thinking of the picture that had appeared in the papers the night before. "How could she get a replica of it?" "How do I know?" shrugged Drummond coldly. Constance looked him squarely in the eyes. "What about Annie Grayson?" she asked point blank. "I have taken care of that," he replied harshly. "She's already under arrest, and from what I have heard, we may get something on her now. We have a record against the Carr girl. We can use it against her friend. We're just about taking her to the flat to identify the Grayson woman. Would you like to come along?" he added in a spirit of bravado. "I think you are a material witness in the Stacy case, anyhow." Constance felt bitterly her defeat. Still, she went with them. There was always a chance that something might turn up. As they entered the door of the kitchenette, loud voices told them that someone was disputing inside. Drummond strode in. The sight of a huge pile of stuff that two strange men had drawn out of drawers and closets and stacked on the table riveted Constance's eyes. Only dimly she could hear that Annie Grayson was violently threatening Drummond, who stood coolly surveying the scene. The stuff on the table was, in fact, quite enough to dazzle the eyes. There were articles of every sort and description there: silks, laces, jewelry and trinkets, little antiques, even rare books, everything small and portable, some of the richest and most exquisite, others of the cheapest and most tawdry. It was a truly remarkable collection, which the raiding detectives had brought to light. As Constance took in the scene, the raiding detectives holding the stormy Annie Grayson at bay, Drummond, cool, supercilious, Kitty almost at the edge of collapse, she wondered how Jim Grayson had managed to slip through the meshes of the net. She had read of such things. Annie Grayson was to all appearances a fence for stolen goods. This was perhaps a school for shoplifters. In addition to her other accomplishments, the queen of the shoplifters was a Fagin, educating others to the tricks of her trade, taking advantage of their lack of facility in disposing of the stolen goods. Just then the woman caught sight of Constance standing in the doorway. In an instant she had broken loose and ran toward her. "What are you?" she hissed. "One of those department store Moll Dicks, too?" Quick as a flash, Kitty Carr had leaped to her feet and placed herself between them. "No, Annie, no. She was a real friend of mine. No, if your own friends had been as loyal as she was to me, this would never have happened. I should never have been caught again, for I should never have given them a chance to get it on me." "Little fool," ground out Annie Grayson, raising her arm. "Here, here, ladies," interposed Drummond, protruding an arm between the two and winking sarcastically to the other two men. "None of that. We shall need both of you in our business. I've no objection to your talking, but cut out the rough stuff." Constance had stepped back. She was cool as Drummond, although she knew her heart was thumping like a sledgehammer. There was Kitty Carr in a revulsion of feeling, her hands pressed tightly to her head again as if it were bursting. She was swaying as if she would faint. Constance caught her gently about the waist and forced her down on the couch where she had been lying the night before. With her back to the others, she reached quickly into her handbag and pulled out the little instrument she had hastily stuffed into it. Deftly, she fastened it to Kitty's wrist and forearm. She dropped down on her knees beside the poor girl and gently stroked her free hand, reassuring her in a low tone. There, she soothed. "You are not well, Kitty. Perhaps, after all, there may be something, some explanation." In spite of all, however, Kitty was on the verge of the wildest hysterics. Annie Grayson sniffed contemptuously at such weakness. Drummond came over, an exasperating sneer on his face. As he looked down, he saw what Constance was doing, and she rose so that all could see now. "This girl," she said, speaking rapidly, "is afflicted with a nervous physical disorder, a mania, which is uncontrollable and takes this outlet. It is emotional insanity, not loss of control of the will, but perversion of the will." "Humph," was Drummond's sole comment, with a significant glance at the pile of goods on the table. "It is not the articles themselves so much," went on Constance, following his glance, "as it is the pleasure, the excitement, the satisfaction, call it what you will, of taking them. A thief works for the benefit he may derive from objects stolen after he gets them. Here is a girl who apparently has no further use for an article after she gets it, who forgets, perhaps hates it." "Oh, yes," remarked Drummond, "but why are they all so careful not to get caught? Everyone is responsible who knows the nature and consequences of his act." Constance had wheeled about. "That is not so," she exclaimed. "Any modern alienist will tell you that. Sometimes the chief mark of insanity may be knowing the nature and consequences, craftily avoiding detection with an almost superhuman cunning. No, the test is whether, knowing the nature and consequences, a person suffers under such a defect of will that, in spite of everything, in the face of everything, that person cannot control that will." As she spoke, she had quickly detached the little instrument and placed it on Annie Grayson's arm. If it had been a Bertillon camera or even a fingerprint outfit, Annie Grayson would probably have fought like a tigress. But this thing was a new one. She had a peculiar spirit of bravado. "Such terms as kleptomania," went on Constance, "are often regarded as excuses framed up by the experts to cover up plain ordinary stealing. But did you wiseacres of crime ever stop to think that perhaps they do actually exist? There are many things that distinguish such a woman as I have described to you from a common thief. There is the insane desire to steal, merely for stealing's sake, a morbid craving. Of course, in a sense, it is stealing, but it is persistent, incorrigible, irrational, motiveless, useless. Stop and think about it a moment," she concluded, lowering her voice and taking advantage of the very novelty of the situation she had created. "Such diseases are the product of civilization, of sensationalism. Naturally enough, then, woman, with her delicately balanced nervous organization, is the first and chief offender, if you insist on calling such a person an offender under your antiquated methods of dealing with such cases." She had paused. "What did you say you called this thing?" asked Drummond, as he tapped the arrangement on Annie Grayson's arm. He was evidently not much impressed by it, yet somehow instinctively regarded it with somewhat of the feelings of an elephant toward a mouse. "That?" answered Constance, taking it off Annie Grayson's wrist before she could do anything with it. "Why, I don't know that I said anything about it. It's really a sphygmomanometer, the little expert witness that never lies, one of the instruments the insurance companies use now to register blood pressure and discover certain diseases. It occurred to me that it might be put to other and equally practical uses, for no one can conceal the emotions from this instrument, not even a person of cast iron nerves." She had placed it on Drummond's arm. He appeared fascinated. "See how it works?" she went on. "You see, 125 millimeters is the normal pressure. Kitty Carr is absolutely abnormal. I do not know, but I think that she suffers from periodical attacks of vertigo. Almost all kleptomaniacs do. During an attack they are utterly irresponsible." Drummond was looking at the thing carefully. Constance turned to Annie Grayson. "Where's your husband?" she asked offhand. "Oh, he disappeared as soon as these department store dicks showed up," she replied bitterly. She had been watching Constance narrowly, quite nonplussed, and unable to make anything out of what was going on. Constance looked at Drummond inquiringly. He shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid we'll never catch him," he said. "He got the jump on us, although we have our lines out for him, too." She had glanced down quickly at the little innocent-looking but telltale sphygmomanometer. "You lie!" she exclaimed suddenly, with all the vigor of a man. She was pointing at the quivering little needle, which registered a sudden, access of emotion, totally concealed by the sang-froid of Drummond's well-schooled exterior. She wrenched the thing off his wrist and dropped it in her bag. A moment later she stood by the open window, facing the street, a bright little police whistle gleaming in her hand, ready for its shrill alarm, if any move were made to cut short what she had to say. She was speaking rapidly now. "You see, I've had it on all of you, one after another, and each has told me your story, just enough of it for me to piece it together. Kitty is suffering from a form of vertigo, an insanity, kleptomania, the real thing. As for you, Mr. Drummond, you were in league with the alleged husband, your own stool pigeon, to catch Annie Grayson." Drummond moved. So did the whistle. He stopped. "But she was too clever for you all. She was not caught, even by a man who lived with her as her own husband, for she was not operating." Annie Grayson moved as if to face out her accusers at this sudden turn of fortune. "One moment, Annie," cut in Constance. "And yet you are the real shoplifter after all. You fell into the trap which Drummond laid for you. I take pleasure, Mr. Drummond, in presenting you with better evidence than even your own stool pigeon could possibly have given you under the circumstances." She paused. "For myself," she concluded, "I claim Kitty Carr. I claim the right to take her, to have her treated for her disease. I claim it because the real shoplifter, the queen of the shoplifters, Annie Grayson, has worked out a brand new scheme, taking up a true kleptomaniac and using her insanity to carry out the stealings which she suggested, and safely to this point has profited by." End of chapter 9. Chapter 10, Part 1 of Constance Dunlap by Arthur B. Reeve. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blackmailers. "They're late this afternoon." "Yes, I think they might be on time. I wish they had made the appointment in a quieter place. What do you care, Anita? Probably somebody else is doing the same thing somewhere else. What's sauce for the gander is sauce for the goose." "I know he has treated me like a dog, Alice, but—" There was just a trace of a catch in the voice of the second woman as she broke off the remark and left it unfinished. Constance Dunlap had caught the words unintentionally above the hum of conversation and the snatches of tuneful music wafted from the large dining room where day was being turned into night. She had dropped into the fashionable new Vanderveer Hotel, not to meet anyone, but because she liked to watch the people in Peacock Alley, as the corridor of the hotel was often popularly called. Somehow, as she sat inconspicuously in a deep chair in an angle, she felt that very few of the gaily chatting couples or of the waiting men and women about her were quite what they seemed on the surface. The conversation from around the angle confirmed her opinion. Here, apparently at least, were two young married women with a grievance, and it was not for those against whom they had the grievance, real or imagined, that they were waiting so anxiously. Constance leaned forward to see them better. The woman nearest her was a trifle the elder of the two, a very attractive-looking woman, tastefully gowned and carefully groomed. The younger, who had been the first speaker, was perhaps the more dashing. Certainly she appeared to be the more sophisticated. And as Constance caught her eye, she involuntarily thought of the old proverb, "Never trust a man who doesn't look you in the eye, or a woman who does." Two men sauntered down the long corridor on the way from a visit to the bar. As they caught sight of the two ladies, there was a smile of recognition, an exchange of remarks between each pair, and the men hurried in the direction of the corner. They greeted the two ladies in low, bantering, familiar terms. Mr. Smith, Mrs. Jones, Mr. White, and Mrs. Brown. "You got my card?" asked one of the men of the woman nearest Constance. "Sorry we're late, but a business friend ran into us as we were coming in, and I had to shunt him off in the other direction." He nodded toward the opposite end of the corridor with a laugh. "You've been bad boys," pouted the other woman, "but we forgive you this time." "Perhaps we may hope to be reinstated after a little tea." "And a dance?" suggested the other man. The four were all moving in the direction of the dining room and the gay music. They had disappeared in the crush about the door before Constance noticed that the woman who had been sitting nearest her had dropped an envelope. She picked it up. It was on the stationery of another fashionable hotel, evidently written by one of those who lounge in, and on the strength of a small bill in the cafe used the writing room. In a man's hand was the name, Mrs. Anita Douglas, The Melcombe Apartments, City. Before she realized it, Constance had pulled out the card inside and glanced at it. It read, My dearest A, can you meet us in the Vanderveer tomorrow afternoon at 4? Bring along your little friend. With many, *****, yours, question. Mechanically, Constance crumpled the card and the envelope in her hand and held them as she regarded the passing throng, intending to throw them away when she passed a scrap basket on the way out. Still, it was a fascinating scene, this of the comedy and tragedy of human weaknesses, and she stayed much longer than she had intended. One by one the people had either gone to dinner in the main dining room or elsewhere, and Constance had nearly decided on going too. She was looking down the corridor toward the desk when she saw something that caused her to change her mind. There was the young lady who had been talking so flippantly to the woman with a grievance, and she was now talking, of all people, to Drummond. Constance shrank back into her wicker chair in the protecting angle. What did it mean? If Drummond had anything to do with it, even remotely, it boded no good, at least. Suddenly, a possible explanation crossed her mind. Was it a sidelight upon that peculiar industry of divorce as practiced in no place except New York? It was not only that Constance longed for, lived by excitement. She felt a sense of curiosity as to what the detective was up to now, and somehow she felt a duty in the case. She determined to return the envelope and card and meet the woman. And the more she thought of it, the more imperative became the idea. So it came about that the following forenoon Constance sought out the Melcombe Apartments, a huge stone and brick affair on a street which the uptown trend of population was transforming. Anita Douglas, she had already found out by an inquiry or two, was the wife of a well-known businessman. Yet as she entered the little apartment, she noticed that there was no evidence about it of a man's presence. Mrs. Douglas greeted her unexpected visitor with an inquiring look. I was passing through the corridor of the Vanderveer yesterday afternoon, began Constance, leaping into the middle of her errand, and I happened to see this envelope lying on the carpet. I thought first of destroying it, then that perhaps you would rather destroy it yourself. Mrs. Douglas almost pounced on the letter as Constance handed it to her. Thank you, she exclaimed. It was very thoughtful of you. For a moment or two they chatted of inconsequential things. Who was your friend? Asked Constance at length. The woman caught her breath and flushed a bit, evidently wondering just how much Constance really knew. The young lady, added Constance, who had put the question in this form purposely. Why do you ask? Mrs. Douglas inquired in a tone that betrayed considerable relief. Because I can tell you something of her, I think. A friend of mine, a Mrs. Murray. Why? Aren't you just a little bit afraid of, friends that you may chance to make in the city? Queried Constance. Afraid? Repeated the other. Yes, said Constance, coming gradually to the point. You know there are so many detectives about. Mrs. Douglas laughed half nervously. Oh, I've been shadowed, she replied confidently. I know how to shake them off. If you can't do anything else, you can always take a taxi. Besides, I think I can uncover almost any shadow. All you have to do, if you think you're being shadowed, is to turn a corner and stop. That uncovers the shadow as soon as he comes up to the corner, and after that he is useless. You know him. That's all right, nodded Constance. But you don't know these crooked detectives nowadays as I do. They can fake up evidence to order. That is their business, you know, to manufacture it. You may uncover a $6 operative, Mrs. Douglas, but are you the equal of a $20 a day investigator? The woman looked genuinely scared. Evidently, Constance knew some things she didn't know, at least about detectives. You don't think there's anything like that, do you? She asked anxiously. Well, replied Constance slowly to impress her, I saw your friend, Mrs. Murray, after you had left the Vanderveer, talking to a detective whom I have every reason to fear as one of the most unscrupulous in the game." "Oh, that is impossible," persisted Mrs. Douglas. "Not a bit of it," pursued Constance. "Think it over for a moment. Who would be the last person a man or woman would suspect of being a detective? Why, just such an attractive young woman, of course. You see, it is just this way. They reason that if they can only get acquainted with people, the rest is easy. For people, under the right circumstances, will tell everything they know." The woman was staring at Constance. "For example," urged Constance, "I'm talking to you now as if I had known you for years. Why, Mrs. Douglas, men tell their most important business secrets to chance luncheon and dinner companions whom they think have no direct or indirect interest in them. Over tea tables, women tell their most intimate personal affairs. In fact, all you have to do is keep your ears open." Mrs. Douglas had risen and was nervously watching Constance, who saw that she had made an impression, and that all that was necessary was to follow it up. "Now, for instance," added Constance quickly, "you say she is a friend of yours. How did you meet her?" Mrs. Douglas did not raise her eyes to Constance's now, yet she seemed to feel that Constance was different from other chance acquaintances, to feel a sort of confidence, and to want to meet frankness with frankness. "One day I was with a friend of mine at the new Palais de Maxis," she answered, in a low voice as if making a confession. "A woman in the dressing room borrowed a cigarette. You know they often do that. We got talking, and it seemed that we had much in common in our lives. Before I went back to him—" She bit her lip. She had evidently not intended to admit that she knew any other men. Constance, however, appeared not to notice the slip. "I had arranged to meet her at luncheon the next day," she continued hastily. "We have been friends ever since." "You went to luncheon with her and—" Constance prompted. "Oh, she told me her story. It was very much like my own. A husband who was a perfect bear, and then gossip about him that so many people, besides his own wife, seemed to know, and—" Constance shook her head. "Really," she observed thoughtfully, "it's a wonder to me how anyone stays married these days. Somebody is always mixing in, getting one or the other so wrought up that they get to thinking there is no possibility of happiness. That's where the crook detective comes in." Anita Douglas, confidence established now, poured out her story unreservedly, as there was little reason why she should not, a story of the refined brutality and neglect and inhumanity of her husband. She told of her own first suspicions of him, of a girl who had been his stenographer, a Miss Helen Brett. But he was careful. There had never been any direct, positive evidence against him. Still, there was enough to warrant a separation and the payment to her of an allowance. They had lived, she said, in a pretty little house in the suburb of Glenclair, near New York. Now that they were separated, she had taken a little kitchenette apartment at the New Melcombe. Her husband was living in the house, she believed, when he was not in the city at his club, or elsewhere, she added bitterly. "But," she confided as she finished, "it is very lonely here in a big city all alone." "I know it is," agreed Constance sympathetically as they parted. "I, too, am often very lonely. Call on me, especially if you find anything crooked going on. Call on me anyhow. I shall be glad to see you any time." The words, "anything crooked going on," rang in Mrs. Douglas's ears long after the elevator door had clanged shut and her new friend had gone. She was visibly perturbed, and the more she thought about it, the more perturbed she became. She had carried on a mild, then an ardent, flirtation with the man who had introduced himself as Mr. White, really Lynn Monroe, but she relied on her woman's instinct in her judgment of him. No, she felt sure that he could not be other than she thought. But as for Alice Murray and her friend, whom she had met at the Palais de Maxis, well, she was forced to admit that she did not know, that Constance's warning might, after all, be true. Monroe had had to run out of town for a few days on a business trip. That she knew, for it had been the reason why he had wanted to see her before he went. He had, in fact, spent the evening in her company, after the other couple had excused themselves on one pretext or another. She called up Alice Murray at the number she had given. She was not there. In fact, no one seemed to know when she would be there. It was strange. because always before it had seemed possible to get her at any moment, almost instantly. That, too, worried her. She tried to get the thing out of her mind, but she could not. She had a sort of foreboding that her new friend had not spoken without reason, a feeling of insecurity as though something were impending over her. The crisis came sooner than even Constance had anticipated when she called on Anita Douglas. It was early in the afternoon, while Anita was still brooding, that a strange man called on her. Instinctively she seemed to divine that he was a detective. He, at least, had the look.
"My name," he introduced himself, "is Drummond."
Drummond paused and glanced about as if to make sure that he could by no possibility be overheard.
"I have called," he continued, "on a rather delicate matter."
He paused for effect, then went on.
"Some time ago I was employed by Mr. Douglas to watch his wife."
He was watching her narrowly to see what effect his sudden remark would have on her. She was speechless.
"Since then," he added quietly, "I have watched. I have seen what I have seen."
Drummond had faced her. Somehow the effect of his words was more potent on her than if he had not accused her by indirection. Still, she said nothing.
"I can suppress it," he insinuated.
Her heart was going like a trip hammer.
"But it will cost something to do that."
Here was a straw. She caught at it eagerly. "Cost something?" she repeated, facing him. "How much?" Drummond never took his eyes from her anxious face.
"I was to get a fee of $1,000 if I obtained some letters that had passed from her to a man named Lynn Monroe. He has gone out of town, has left his rooms unguarded. I have the letters."
She felt a sinking sensation. $1,000? Suddenly the truth of the situation flashed over her. He had come with an offer that set her bidding against her husband for the letters, and in a case of dollars her husband would win. $1,000! It was blackmail. I can't afford it," she pleaded weakly. "Can't you make it less?" Drummond shook his head. Already he had learned what he had come to learn. She did not have the money.
"No," he replied positively,
adding by way of inserting the knife and turning it around,
"I shall have to turn the letters over to him today."
She drew herself up. At least she could fight back. "But you can't prove anything," she cut in quickly.
"Can't I?" he returned. "The letters don't speak for themselves, do they? You don't realize that this interview helps to prove it, do you? An innocent woman wouldn't have considered my offer, much less plead with me. Bah! Can't prove anything. Why, it's all in plain black and white."
Drummond flicked the ashes from his cigar into the fireplace as he rose to go. At the door, he turned for one parting shot.
"I have all the evidence I need," he concluded. "I've got the goods on you. Tonight it will be locked in his safe. Documentary evidence. If you should change your mind, you can reach me at his office. Call under an assumed name. Mrs. Green, perhaps."
He was gone, with a mocking smile at the parting shot. End of Part 1 of Chapter 10.